Page 81, Chapter 11. As I dragged myself home that day, my mind was a jumble. Franks had gotten what he deserved. I knew that. Still, you can't lose your best player and not pay a price. My stomach turned when I thought about the 7 games left to play. I felt so low I didn't look up as I opened the front door. That's why I heard his voice before I saw him. "Hey, Seth, what's going on?" Sitting on the sofa was Jimmy Winter. My mother brought out 2 bowls of ice cream and then left us alone. I guess she figured we'd have a lot to talk about, and I suppose we did, but for a long time we couldn't connect. It was like I knew him but didn't know him, like he was both my best friend and a total stranger. "My mom and I are back in the old house," Jimmy said. "Starting tomorrow, I'll be going to Woodside, too." I wanted to ask if the divorce was off, but I couldn't get the words out. We talked about nothing for a while. Then he said he had to go. "I'll walk partway with you," I said. The sky was black, no moon, no stars even. Walking a couple of blocks in the blackness made it easier to talk. "How's your father doing?" I asked, almost in a whisper. Jimmy looked down. "He shows up once in a while, but I don't see him much." "And your mom?" He shrugged. "She's better, I guess. We're moving back, so she's not so afraid anymore. Her big thing is still for my father to get counseling. She thinks that if he stopped drinking, they could get back together." "Maybe they could." Jimmy scoffed at the idea. "He'll never change. Besides, he's got his girlfriend." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was hard. "You know what I wish, Seth? I wish he would move away to Alaska or New York or somewhere. I wish I never had to see him again for as long as I live." "You don't mean that," I said. "Yes, I do," Jimmy said with conviction. "Yes, I do." Chapter 12, page 82. I knew Jimmy wasn't in the honors program, but I hoped he'd be in my gym class or my French class. It turned out he wasn't taking a foreign language, and he had gym first period while I had it third. So the only time we had together was lunch. In the cafeteria, I plunked my tray down next to his. I started to ask how his classes had gone, but he wanted to talk baseball. "Why didn't you tell me your coach was Rick Charant?" "I don't know," I said. "I didn't think about it." "You know, you didn't think about it? You've got a major leaguer as a coach and you didn't think about it?" I tried to explain. "This season hasn't worked out, not for him and not for us." I rattled on about our losing streak and about Todd Franks quitting. Jimmy was silent for a long time. When I finished, I knew he was thinking about something. Then, just before lunch ended, he came out with it. "I know the season is almost over, but do you think I might still be able to get on the team? I mean, since this Franks guy quit?" "I don't know," I said, excited at the idea, "but it can't hurt to ask." That afternoon, Charant ran Jimmy through a quick tryout while the rest of us warmed up. Jimmy fielded grounders for about 5 minutes, then Charant called him in for batting practice. Kister pitched, and Jimmy smacked 4 of the first dozen pitches he saw out of the park. His swing looked perfect to me, but not to Charant. He took the bat out of Jimmy's hands and started demonstrating changes he wanted. "You're overstriding and you're opening up your left shoulder too soon. You don't want to become a dead pull hitter. You'll get a few more home runs, but you'll lose 30 points off your batting average." Charant handed the bat back to Jimmy. "Try it my way. If I'd been Jimmy, I'd have been burned." He pounded the cover off the ball. What more did Charant want? But Jimmy wasn't me. He took the bat back, and for the next dozen pitches, he tried to do exactly what Charant wanted, even though all it got him were a bunch of dribblers and pop-ups. "Stick with it," Charant said when they finished. "Those changes will pay off for you. Now let's go to my office." When Jimmy came out, he was carrying Todd Frank's uniform over his arm. I hadn't given up on this season. None of the guys had, or at least we didn't think we had. But at 09, we didn't quite have the same zip we had on the first day of practice, and that's why Jimmy made us look bad. He played like he always did, all out. He took grounders off his chest. He slid hard into the bases. He backed up every play. At the plate, he swung only at strikes in his zone. "That's how you should all be playing," Charant yelled, "like Jimmy Winter. He has only been here 1 day and he already understands what I want." A player like that can become pretty unpopular pretty fast. "Tell your red-hot buddy to cool it tomorrow," Junior Tupou muttered to me as we headed over to the track once practice had ended. Charant lined us up, blew his whistle, and we took off. I should have known Jimmy wouldn't fall back in the pack and let Charant run away from him. Jimmy never let anybody beat him in anything without a fight, but I didn't think Jimmy had a real chance to win. Charant had the lead the first mile, but Jimmy stayed within 4 or 5 strides. Between a mile and a half, Jimmy faded. He dropped 8 strides back, 10, 12. I figured it was over, but with a half a mile to go, Jimmy picked it up. He didn't sprint. Nobody sprints in 80. He pumped his legs a tiny bit faster, and with every stride he cut into Charant's lead. I was running with 4 or 5 other guys. We were maybe 60 yards behind. Our eyes were glued on Jimmy. It was like he was running for all of us. With 1 lap to go, Jimmy pulled even. Charant looked over and then kicked a little. He pulled 5 yards ahead, then 10. With 2:20 left, Charant was at least 15 yards in front, but you could see he was feeling it. I kept hoping Jimmy would reel him in with a little spring of his own, but it didn't look like he had anything left. Charant was laboring, no doubt about it, but from the 220 mark to the 100-yard mark, he held his lead. That's when Jimmy put the pedal to the floor. It's not many times that you think of human beings as animals, but that's what it was. One animal chasing down another one. Jimmy's arms pumped. His legs drove into the cinder track. He sucked air by the gallon. With about 65 yards left, Charant completely tied up. That's the worst feeling in the world. Everybody who runs knows it. Your legs feel like redwood trees. You gasp for air and you can't get enough. Your lungs burn and there's a knife in your guts. Track guys call it having a bear on your back, but to me it feels more like a mountain. Jimmy caught Charant with 30 yards to go, and he roared by him like a train roars by a station without riders. Charant staggered in, then collapsed on the infield grass, his face bright red. I crossed the finish line about 30 seconds later. Instead of feeling dead, exhausted, I was exhilarated, and so were the rest of the guys. We gathered around Jimmy, patting him on the back and giving him a good shake. He looked like he might puke. We didn't care. If we'd had the energy, we would have picked him up and carried him to the shower room. I don't think I knew how much Charant's victories were eating at me until Jimmy put an end to them. It was as if we were all living in someone's shadow. Jimmy brought us out into the light. The next practice, Jimmy was the leader of the team. Instead of looking at him like he was some weird gung-ho type, the other guys copied his hustle. A fire was in our practice that hadn't been there before. The smile on Charant's face went ear to ear, and it stayed there even when Jimmy whipped him again in the 2-mile run. Then, right before our next game, Charant announced that Jimmy would be batting third and starting at shortstop. It's amazing when you think about it. A guy joins at the tail end of the season, and within a week, he's the heart of the team, but nobody griped. Jimmy had earned it. The game was on Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. We took a little batting practice, tossed the ball around the infield. The umpire looked at his clock and yelled, "Play ball!" I settled into my spot between first and second, crouched and waited for Kister to deliver the first pitch. That's when Jimmy started. "Hey, batter, batter," he screamed as the Bellarmine leadoff batter came to the plate. None of us had ever gotten into any chatter, not even during our early games, but Jimmy was screaming on every pitch. "Hum, baby, hum, baby, hum." Jimmy yelled all by himself for the first dozen pitches of the game. Dan Hill, our third baseman, looked over at me. How can it hurt, I thought. So I started, easy out, I chirped. Once I started, Hill took it up. Hey, swing! It was stupid, but it was fun, and we hadn't had much fun that year. Bellarmine went down in order. Their pitcher started the game wild, walking our leadoff hitter, Devin Maxwell, and then plunking me with a slow curve that brought Jimmy up with the chance to knock in a run and maybe start a big inning. The first at bat is tough. No matter what league you're in, no matter how good you are, your heart is pounding and you're fighting your nerves as much as the pitcher. Jimmy took a fastball outside. The Bellarmine pitcher went into his stretch, delivered. Jimmy took the velvet smooth swing and caught the ball on the sweet spot. The ball rocketed off his bat. Their center fielder ran about 5 steps back, stopped, looked up. Jimmy's home run cleared the center field fence by 50 feet. The guys were so stunned they hardly clapped. Even Charant was speechless. In the Bellarmine dugout, players were pointing to where the ball had landed and were shaking their heads. When Jimmy started with the chatter in the second inning, we all took it up. Infielders and outfielders without even thinking about it. "You're a bum, you're no good, you swing like an old lady." The old corny phrases filled the park. We were into the game. Bellarmine did zip for the next 3 innings, but we couldn't add to our lead. In the 5th, they scratched out a run, and they scored again in the 6th on a 2-out triple. Jimmy was still loose, still chattering, but the rest of us tightened. The apple was in our throats. We could feel another late-inning choke coming. In the bottom of the 6th, I laced a single into left, and when their left fielder bobbled it, it took off for a second. I slid into the bag head first. It was a bang-bang play, but my hand caught the sack just before the glove slapped my wrist. The ump stretched out his arms out. "Safe!" It didn't look like my hustle would matter, though. Jimmy lined out. Junior Tupou popped up, but on a 2-2 pitch, Hill blooped a single to right. I was off on contact and scored without a throw, putting us up 4-2. Bellarmine was down to their last 3 outs, but Kister was tired. If we'd had a decent relief pitcher, Charant would have brought him in. Their first batter hit a scorcher right at Jimmy. It took a wicked bounce and caught him on the throat. He collapsed in a heap as the ball trickled into short left field. I raced over to Jimmy, and the Bellarmine player, seeing second base uncovered, cruised into second. Jimmy was up by the time Charant reached him. "I'm okay," he insisted. "It didn't catch me square." That took guts because the ball had caught Jimmy flush on the Adam's apple. Bellarmine's next hitter popped up to first, but Kister walked the guy after that. The next batter roped Kister's first pitch into to drive in a run, making the score 4-3 and putting runners at first and second with only one out. I looked at Jimmy. His face had turned ghostly white. His eyes were glassy and his lips were blue. He had to come out of the game. But before I could call time, Kister stretched and delivered. The Bellarmine hitter ripped a shot between me and the first baseman. I got a good jump on the ball, and when I snagged it, I was thinking of the double play. I wheeled and fired the ball to Jimmy. The Bellarmine base runner was barreling down on him, but Jimmy hung in there. He took the throw, dragged his foot across the bag, and blazed a strike to first just before he was creamed by a rolling slide. Jimmy's throw was in time. Double play. Game over. 4-3 Woodside. We didn't celebrate, at least not right away, because Jimmy was lying on the ground, his head rocking back and forth like he had malaria. A doctor came out of the stands and told Jimmy to breathe nice and easy. Slowly, he came back. "Did we win?" were the first words out of his mouth. Chapter 14, page 89. The monkey was off of our back, and it stayed off. We won our next 3 games, 8-6, 6-5, and 7-6. I'm usually a shower person, but my muscles ached so much during the winning streak that after every practice, after every game, I'd slide into the tub and soak. The hot water would sting in a dozen places where my skin was raw. The raw skin was why we were winning. Before Jimmy joined the team, I would have been insulted if somebody had told me I wasn't giving 100%, but I hadn't been. Those bruises proved it. Jimmy had that knack. He made me dig a little deeper inside and find a little more than I thought I had. And it wasn't just me, it was every guy on the team. Jimmy had the heart of a champion, and he pumped a little of his blood into our veins. I was so caught up in our winning streak that I pretty much forgot about his father and all that. Maybe I didn't really forget. Maybe it was more that I hoped the whole problem would go away. But after practice one Thursday, as we were walking home along the Alameda, a car pulled up. "Hey, Jimmy. Hey, Seth. You boys want to ride?" Mr. Winter was smiling broadly. Next to him was a new woman, even younger than his other girlfriend. Jimmy turned bright red. Instead of answering, he stared first at his father, then at the woman, and finally at me. "That's okay, Mr. Winter," I said. "We just finished practice. The walk cools us down." Mr. Winter kept smiling, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Okay, suit yourselves. It's good seeing you two. Maybe I'll catch a game sometime. Goodbye, Jimmy. Goodbye, Seth." Jimmy still didn't answer. "Goodbye, Mr. Winter," I managed for both of us. We were quiet until we reached the corner where Jimmy turned off, but just before he went his way, he spoke, almost in a whisper. "Seth, sometimes I think you're lucky your father is dead. At least you know where you stand. I never know." It was a strange thing to say, and if anybody else had said it, I would have been angry. But coming from Jimmy, I understood. I suppose in a small way he was right. I never really knew my father, so he didn't tear me up day in and day out the way Jimmy's father tore him up. But Jimmy was wrong too, wrong in a way he'd never know. My father's death had left a hole in my life, a hole that could never be filled. No matter what Jimmy's father did, no matter how badly he acted, he was there. For me, it's different. You can't see emptiness, but that doesn't mean you don't feel it. I'm not saying I feel it all the time. Days, even weeks go by and I don't think of my father once, but then out of the blue, the emptiness comes. Chapter 15. After our 4th straight win, Todd Franks pulled up a chair next to me while I was studying in the library. "I hear you won again. That Jimmy Winter must be some ball player." "He's good," I said, "real good." Franks opened an atlas, but he wasn't in the library to study. He wanted something. "Have you heard that Connect won't coach varsity baseball next year, that he's retiring?" "No." "Well, he is. Word is that Charant will take his place." "Really?" I answered. It makes sense, doesn't it?" Franks went on. "You don't bring in a major leaguer to coach freshmen." I nodded. "Yeah, I guess it does make sense. Seth, you know how Charant thinks. Would he take me back on a team if I apologized?" "I don't know. He might." Franks stood. "I'm going to give it a try." He rapped his knuckles on the table. "I miss baseball. I didn't think I would, but I do. It's hard to explain how I felt. Franks was a great player. With him and Jimmy, we'd be dynamite. Still, part of me hoped Charant wouldn't let him back." Charant gave us the news before practice. "Todd Franks has rejoined the team. He's in the locker room dressing right now. I hope you're glad to have him back. I know I am." I couldn't help watching Franks that afternoon. I guess we all did. It'd been his team. He'd been our big stick, but now it was Jimmy's. A run-in had to happen, and it came during the 2nd hour of practice. While Charant was working with the pitchers, Dan Hill was hitting balls to the rest of us. Hill blooped a little pop into short center. Jimmy was off with the crack of the bat. He ran out from under his cap and dived and came up 6 inches short. He pulled himself to his feet and retrieved the ball. Then he glared at Todd. "That was your ball!" he screamed. Todd had jogged in. He hadn't even tried for the pop fly. Jimmy's anger took him by surprise. "This is practice, champ," he said, "not the World Series." Jimmy fixed Todd with those icy green eyes of his. "Don't call me champ, and don't loaf. Nobody loafs on this team." Todd's eyes narrowed. For an instant, I thought the two of them would have it out right there. But a strange thing happened. Todd's face relaxed. "Sorry, Winter," he said. "It won't happen again." Then he trotted back to center field. On the next fly ball to center, Todd ran like it was the World Series. Well, with Franks playing hard, we were really something. We destroyed Carlmont 11-3 and Palo Alto 15-2. They had to stop Palo Alto game after 5 innings because of darkness. Every starter had a hit. Jimmy and Todd both had 4. Our last game was against St. Francis. They clinched first place, and we were in 5th place. If we lost, our season would be over, but if we won at 7-9, we'd finish in 4th place and sneak into the playoffs. It was crazy, but that's how it worked. And once we were in, I figured we'd have a decent chance to take the title. I wouldn't have said it out loud, but I thought we'd roll right over St. Francis. Even when they scored twice in the top of the first on a walk, an error, and a double, I didn't sweat it. I don't think the other guys did either. I figured we'd pound out as many hits and as many runs as we needed. Winning streaks make you feel that way. As I went to the bat rack in the bottom of the first, Jimmy slid up next to me. "Recognize the pitcher?" he asked. I looked out toward the mound. The guy looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. Listen to the catcher's glove pop. That's Steve Cannon. I'm sure of it. My mouth dropped open. I took one deep breath and then another, and I was trying to slow my heartbeat. If I was going to hit Cannon, I couldn't be afraid of him. I didn't even watch Devin Maxwell's at-bat. I swung 2 bats on the on-deck circle and told myself over and over that Cannon was just another pitcher. Then I heard the umpire yell, "Strike 3!" I wasn't beaten before I went up there. I really wasn't. I told myself I could hit Cannon, and I thought I could, until the first pitch. Then it was as if I were back in Little League again. Cannon's first fastball blew by me like an express train. He reared back and fired another one, and then one more, and I sat down. I wasn't the only one. Cannon struck out almost everybody else, too. Jimmy got a double in the 4th, and Todd followed with an RBI single, but that was our only run. Cannon had spells of wildness when he'd walk a couple of guys. Still, he always had his fastball when he needed it. St. Francis's 2-1 lead held all the way to our last at-bats. As we came in, gloom settled over us. 3 more outs, and we wouldn't make the playoffs. Jimmy took a bat and raked it against the fence, trying to wake us up. "Give me a chance, guys," he screamed. "Give me one more at-bat. I can hit this guy." I knew he could. We all knew he could. He was magic. If we could get him to the plate, he'd do it for us, but that was the big if. He was hitting 6 that inning. Cannon started off like it would be over in 9 pitches. He threw 3 blazing strikes right past our first guy, but our pinch hitter, Keith May, got lucky. He took a weak swing at an inside fastball. The ball dribbled up the first baseline, a swinging bunt he beat out easily. We had some life, and Cannon was showing signs of tiring. His first pitch to Fred Pacheco was a slow curve way inside that caught Fred in the leg. Now we really did have something cooking. First and second, one out, Maxwell up. St. Francis's coach walked slowly out to the mound. As I swung a bat in the on-deck circle, I was praying that he'd yank Cannon. The coach looked down to the bullpen a couple of times. Once he almost motioned, but then he left Cannon in. Maxwell didn't see any slow curveballs, that's for sure. Cannon reached back and whaled the ball. The first 2 pitches were strikes, but Cannon overthrew his 3rd pitch. Trying too hard, the ball sailed over the catcher's head. Both runners moved up a base, a single, a measly little base, hit anywhere, and we'd win. Maxwell tugged the bill of his cap. Cannon stared in, wound, delivered. Maxwell spun away. "Strike 3, the ump yelled. From the third base coach's box, Charant yelled at the umpire, "What kind of call is that? That pitch almost hit him." The ump stepped in front of the plate, dusted it off. "Your boy bailed out," he snarled at Charant and then motioned me into the batter's box. I didn't have to win the game, but I had to keep the inning going. A walk, a hit by a pitch, anything to get Jimmy to the plate. I pulled the bat back, took a deep breath. Cannon delivered a fastball right down the pike. I saw it good, uncoiled as fast as I could, and fouled it straight back into the screen. I can't explain how wonderful that felt. It was just a crummy foul ball, but it meant that Cannon was tiring and that I had a chance. This game. I stepped out, tugged at my pants, stepped back in. Immediately, Cannon went into his windup, a fastball. What else? Again, I took a rip at it. This time, I caught it solid, right in the sweet spot, but late. The ball shot down the right field line, foul by 20 feet. He glared at me. He stood on the mound and glared at me like a boxer glares at his opponent before a fight. I think he was insulted that I'd gotten my bat on the ball. He didn't scare me. All he did was pump me up even more. He went into his windup and delivered. The instant I picked up the ball, I pulled the trigger, and I was on it. I was on it perfectly, only it wasn't a fastball. Cannon had pulled the string, thrown me a changeup. I was way out in front. I tried to yank the bat back, but I couldn't. I was so off balance, I fell down as the ump yelled, "Strike 3!" I felt like an idiot lying there in the dirt. Jimmy grabbed me by the elbow and pulled me up. "Don't sweat it, Seth. You got your cuts. Besides, Cannon is the one who backed down." Chapter 16, page 96. In the locker room after the game, Todd invited Jimmy and me to a party at his house that Saturday. I don't know, Jimmy said. I'm not much for parties. Todd looked disgusted. Listen, Jimmy, I've done things your way, haven't I? Now the season's over. Time to try things my way, okay? Jimmy laughed. Okay. Saturday night, Jimmy and I caught a bus up the Alameda to Atherton. Todd had drawn us a map, but it was still hard to find his house. Atherton is real ritzy, and all the streets wind around. When we finally found the number, we thought we had the wrong night or something. No music, hardly any lights. The big house looked deserted. Jimmy knocked on the door, and we waited and knocked again. There's no party, I said. Let's get out of here. Just then, Todd's father opened the front door. He had jet black hair and was wearing a coat and tie. He introduced himself, asked us how we were doing, and then pointed to a path that led around back. Todd's room is around there, he said. Follow the walkway. Todd's room turned out to be more like a small house. He had a bedroom and then next to it a rec room with a pool table and a refrigerator and a sink and a big screen TV and an unbelievable stereo system. Two other guys were there, Devin Maxwell and Junior Tupou. Both of them were drinking beer. You guys want a brew? Todd asked, opening the refrigerator. No, Jimmy said. I shook my head too. We shot pool for a while and watched the Giants play the Mets on the tube. Todd kept asking Jimmy if he wanted a beer, and then the more Jimmy said no, the more Todd pushed. Listen, he finally said, I'll play a game of 8-ball. You win. I stop drinking. I win. You loosen up a little, okay? Jimmy could never turn down a competition. Only it wasn't competition. Todd creamed him, which shouldn't have been a surprise. It was his pool table, and I don't think Jimmy had played pool more than 2 or 3 times in his life. When the match was over, Todd popped open a beer and handed it to Jimmy. I got myself one too. I figured on drinking 1 beer and no more, but it didn't work that way. When Jimmy finished his first, Todd challenged him again. Jimmy lost again, and I found myself drinking a second. After that second beer went down, I didn't think twice about taking a third, a fourth, a fifth, and neither did Jimmy. I could lie and say I had a miserable time, but the truth is I had fun. We all did. We shot pool and talked about baseball and about girls. I'm not going to write down any of the stuff we said because what I remember seems really stupid, though it didn't seem stupid then. I didn't pay attention to the time, neither did Jimmy, and when I finally looked at my watch, it was after 11:30. The bus stopped running at midnight, so we had to hustle to catch it. Bouncing around in the back, I started to feel a little sick to my stomach. Jimmy probably felt the same way because he didn't say one word, and when he got off, he barely waved. My head was spinning when I opened my front door. Fortunately, my mother was asleep. I slipped silently down the hall and dropped onto my bed. I lay there, trying to get a hold of myself, when that first taste of barf worked its way up my throat and into my mouth. I choked it down, but then I belched, and it came back stronger, and I barely made it to the toilet before I puked my guts out. I took a shower, then threw my clothes in the wash, and when I hit the sack again, it was after 1, I dropped right to sleep. In the morning, my head ached, my mouth burned, my stomach churned, and I worried. I was sure my mother had heard me throwing up or that she'd become suspicious about the load of wash. When that didn't happen, I thought maybe Todd's parents would find the beer bottles and get the names of everyone at the party. The whole morning I lived in dread and that everything would blow up in my face, but it didn't, and nothing happened. Around noon, I headed over to Henry Ford. Jimmy was already there. He gave me a thin smile. I don't feel much like playing baseball today. He didn't get any argument from me. Page 99, chapter 17. In June, Jimmy took me and Todd Franks to Tom Wells Sports on El Camino. Somehow, probably through his father, Jimmy knew the owner, a nice older guy with thinning hair and a fat stomach. Anyway, around back was an old pitching machine the San Jose Bees had used. The owner said we could hit for as long as we wanted. Just don't set the speed above 70 miles an hour, he said before he went back inside. I don't trust that machine, and I don't want anybody getting hurt. For Jimmy and Todd, it was a competition from day one. They'd take turns drilling line drives into the netting. When one of them caught the ball solid, he'd look at the other guy as if to say, I bet you can't match that. The other guy would step in, and after he'd nailed one, he'd look over with an expression that said that was for you. I wanted to be in on the competition. Maybe I didn't hit the ball as often as they did, but I swung so viciously that when I did hit it, I hit it almost as hard. The crack of my bat driving through the ball was sweet. In the beginning of the summer, Jimmy and Todd kept the machine at 70, just like the owner had said, but in July, they started to cranking up the speed. I stayed with them through 75 miles an hour, but around 80, they lost me. When it was my turn, I moved the machine back to 75, and all 3 of us pretended it didn't matter, but it mattered. It mattered a lot. So every once in a while, I'd hack at pitches coming at 80. Talk about frustrating. I'd see the ball perfectly, I'd be right on it, only it would be past me. I'd end up swinging at the breeze. Drop the speed, Jimmy would say, and I'd do it, but I felt like I was a tag-along little brother by the end of the summer. It was so frustrating. I was so frustrated. I was actually glad to be getting back to school and away from that machine. Page 100, chapter 18. On the first day back at Woodside came good news. Charant was the new head coach of the varsity baseball. He's going to look to the future, Jimmy said. He'll stack the team with sophomores. I wanted to believe Jimmy, but I wasn't so sure. He'll still give the juniors and seniors first shot at everything. Jimmy brushed that off. Why should he? Those guys went 4-18 last year. He doesn't know them. Besides, he knows us. I'm telling you, it's there for the taking. I wanted to take it, so did Jimmy and Todd. What really aided us was waiting. The first half of that school year dragged. School was school. It wasn't like being a freshman when the honors program was new and scary and time raced by. As a sophomore, I sat in class, did worksheets, studied at home. Then the next day, I do the same thing, and the next day I do the same thing. Sometimes I wondered if baseball season would ever come. My social life was pretty routine too. Every week or two, Todd would get his hands on some beer and invite Jimmy and me over. We'd shoot pool, talk about girls and baseball, and drink. We didn't get caught, not once in all that time, though we did have a couple of close calls. The first came the day after Thanksgiving. The buses were running on holiday schedule. Jimmy and I didn't know it, so we ended up stuck at the Alameda at midnight. I had to call my mother to pick us up. The whole ride home, she kept asking me if I was sick. You don't look right, she said. I'm just tired, I told her. She frowned when she looked over her shoulder and saw Jimmy slumped down in the back seat, but she didn't push it. The second close call came over Christmas break. We were in Todd's room one Tuesday afternoon when his father, who'd come home early from work, knocked on the door. It was bad enough madly trying to hide the beer bottles under the chairs and behind the stereo, but the worst part was trying to act calm when his father was in the room. Mr. Franks shot pool with us for a half an hour or so. He was laughing and joking, and we tried to laugh and joke with him. But Jimmy and I were sweating bullets, and Todd was 10 times worse. If anybody had asked us if we had been big drinkers, we would have said no. We were baseball players. We were athletes. Drinking didn't fit, and we knew it, but Todd got beer whenever he could, and whenever he got it, we drank it. Chapter 19, page 102. I figured that Jimmy's father must have moved away because all through fall I never saw him. Redwood City isn't that big. If he were around, I'd have run into him at Woodside Plaza or down on the boardwalk. I suppose I could have asked Jimmy about him, but I figured if Jimmy had anything to say, he'd say it. That's why what happened that Saturday in January was such a shock. Jimmy and I were hitting grounders to each other at Henry Ford when a bright red Chevy Camaro pulled up. The horn sounded. We looked at each other. Who's that? I asked. Beats me, Jimmy replied. A second later, Mr. Winter popped out of the car. I was hoping to find you boys here. You don't mind if an old guy joins in, do you? You'd have thought he hadn't been gone a day. It's hard to say how I felt that afternoon. Mr. Winter was trying to be a good guy, but he overdid it. When Jimmy made a fairly good catch or throw, Mr. Winter acted like he was a Golden Glover. Put that one on the highlight reel. Super slick. Awesome. Corny stuff like that, over and over, and the opposite of the way he'd always been. Jimmy was dying inside. He was stone-faced the whole 2 hours his father was there. That put the pressure on me. I had to be doubly cheerful to make up. Mr. Winter and I grinned away at each other while Jimmy glowered at both of us. The whole thing was weird. Finally, Jimmy couldn't take it anymore. I've got some stuff to do, he said. I'm going home. His father held up his hands like a traffic cop. Wait a second. You're not in such a hurry. You don't have time for a soft drink? It was kind of sad. He was treating us as if we were still little kids who'd go crazy for a soda. When Mr. Winter opened his cooler, I expected to see some beer, but there was nothing but Coke. I saw Jimmy stare long and hard at that cooler, too. Early the next morning, Jimmy phoned. I don't know if you want to meet me at Henry Ford today or not. My father might show again. I can't do anything about it. He's always had visiting rights. Now he's in some alcohol treatment program, and he says he wants to get to know me again. Jimmy's voice was filled with anger, and I didn't understand. What's wrong with that? I asked. He won't follow through, Seth. He never does. A part of me wanted out of the whole thing, but Jimmy was my friend. I don't care if your father shows. I don't have anything against him. His father did show every Saturday and Sunday for the next month. Mr. Winter smiled his way through a couple of hours of baseball, then pulled out his cooler filled with Cokes. I kept thinking that something had to give, that Jimmy would have to break down and start being nicer, or that Mr. Winter would explode, but nothing changed. As the weeks rolled by, I found myself more and more on Mr. Winter's side. The way I saw it, Mr. Winter was trying, but Jimmy wouldn't give him a break. I kept thinking there was something I should do, and finally my mother noticed. What's wrong, Seth? You seem a million miles away. I didn't plan on telling her much, but once I started, I told her everything, including the fact that I was fed up with Jimmy. Seth, you don't know all that's gone on in that house. That made me angry. I know Mr. Winter used to drink, but he stopped. What more does Jimmy want? My mother pursed her lips. I bet Jimmy has seen his father stop drinking a dozen times, minimum, and every time he's watched his father start again. Once alcohol gets a grip on a person, it's tough to shake free, ever. She paused. You remember that for yourself, too. Instantly, my heart raced. That's not fair, I said. I'm not into drinking or drugs or anything. Why are you giving me a lecture? My mother was startled. Pretty touchy, aren't you? That was hardly a lecture. I'm not touchy, I snapped. I'm just saying you shouldn't act like what, Seth? Oh, I don't know. I stood trying to think of something to say. Look, I've got homework, I finally managed before retreating to my room. That Saturday night, Jimmy and I were supposed to go to Todd's. At school on Friday, I pulled him aside. We shouldn't be doing this, I said. It's stupid. If we get caught, Charant will never let us play varsity. Jimmy looked puzzled. We won't get caught. I sucked up my courage. Look, isn't it crazy to be down on your father for drinking and then go out and drink yourself? Jimmy's eyes turned mean. It's not the same at all, Seth. My father drank every single day. I saw him. I lived with him. You didn't. What we're doing isn't anything like what he did. I started to say something else, but he interrupted. Don't come if you don't want to. Then he stalked off. All that day I told myself I wouldn't go, but Saturday afternoon, after Jimmy and I played a little ball, things looked different. The regular time tonight, I asked. Jimmy nodded. The regular time. When varsity tryouts came, I ached inside. I wanted to make the team, to turn double plays, to score runs, to have a varsity letter on my school jacket. I wanted it just like Jimmy and Todd did. I didn't want to be the one stuck on junior varsity, the one left out. I was worried about my fielding. Hitting is what worried me. I wasn't worried about my fielding. Hitting is what worried me. I was certain I'd do or die at the plate. Dan Duncan, a junior and my main competition at second, was strictly a banjo hitter. He put the ball in play, moved runners up, bunted pretty well, but he had zero pop in his bat. During batting practice, I muscled up on the pitches I saw. I'm not saying I drove the ball like Jimmy or Todd. Those guys really put on a show. But for a second baseman, I hit a few shots. I whiffed a few too, but that happens if you swing hard. Charant stood behind the cage watching. After I'd really smacked one, I'd peek back. I couldn't read his face. Sometimes it would seem like I'd pound the ball hard and he'd scowl. 4 days into tryouts, Jimmy pulled me aside. You're a second baseman, he told me. You don't have to murder the ball. Just make contact and you can't let your defense slide. That got me mad. I'm not going to make the team hitting ground balls, Jimmy. I got to make an impression. Besides, I don't see you cutting down on your swing any. It's different for me. That really frosted me. Why? Why is it different for you? Maybe I'm a better hitter than you think. He shrugged. Do what you want, Seth. That's what I did. I made sure I didn't get cheated when I stepped up to the plate. While Dan Duncan was hitting ground ball after ground ball, I was back up in the middle. I was cracking a few off the fences. Before practice the second Monday, Charant called out a bunch of names. Mine was one of them. We followed him into the gym conference room. He put his hands up to quiet us. Then he started pacing around. Believe me, I know what it feels like to hear this kind of news, so I'm going to spit it out fast. I'm assigning all of you to the junior varsity. Report to Mr. Blackman on field 3. There was a general groan. Charant clapped his hands. Hey, listen, I know you boys are disappointed, but don't quit. If you play well and some varsity player dogs it, I'll move you up and send him down. That's a promise. Jimmy was waiting outside. Was that what I think it was? I nodded. Jimmy looked down. Sorry, Seth, he mumbled. Then he hustled off to the field 1 while I walked over to field 3. JV practice ended an hour before varsity practice. I'd always hated Charant's 2-mile run, but as I watched the varsity players chug around the track, I would have given anything to be with them. I hung around to walk home with Jimmy. I wanted to complain about getting cut. I wanted Jimmy to tell me I'd gotten a raw deal. But before I could say anything, he started telling me about his father. He's moving to San Francisco, Jimmy said, to live with this new woman. He might even marry her someday. It's for sure I won't see him much anymore. I thought you didn't want to see him anyway, I said, and I knew I was being mean. So why do you care? I don't care, Jimmy said defiantly. I don't. After that, we walked silently up Alameda for a couple of blocks. I was licking my wounds about being cut, and I figured Jimmy was thinking about his father, but he wasn't. It was his mother he was thinking about. He told me she'd given up on his father, too. That's what you always wanted, isn't it? I asked, still being mean. Yeah, I suppose so, only... He paused. Seth, do you think your mother will ever remarry? No, an electric shock jolted my body. No? Why not? I don't know, I said, floundering. I'm just sure she won't. Jimmy looked puzzled. She's probably lonely, don't you think? I mean, it makes sense to me she'd want to get married again. I figure my mother will. Well, my mother isn't going to, I said. Let's drop it, okay? For the rest of the day, I did everything I could to keep from thinking about Jimmy's question, but it was the only thing I could think about. He was right. It would be natural for any mother to remarry. I don't know why I'd never thought about it before. Jimmy sure saw it with his mother right away. Maybe I blinded myself because I didn't want to face the truth. My mother was smart and she was pretty. She'd have no trouble meeting some man who'd want to marry her. It would be the best thing for her. I knew it, but that didn't mean I wanted it. I couldn't imagine having some strange man living in our house giving me orders. Would he expect me to call him Dad? Just the thought of it made my head pound.